I want to convey a very special and very warm welcome to all of you this evening to our Peter G. Peterson Institute for International Economics. This is our 8th annual Stavros S. Niarchos Lecture. This is literally the premier event that we hold at the Institute every year, thanks to the generosity of the Niarchos Foundation. We invite a very select group that we know will enjoy and benefit from the lecture and will stimulate a conversation after the initial remarks that will be enlightening and of keen interest to all of us. I want to start by expressing our deep appreciation for the support of the Niarchos Foundation for the lecture series and for other contributions they have made to the Institute over the years as well, and invite Andreas Dracopoulos, who is now co-president of the Board of Directors of the Foundation and a member of the Board of Directors of our Institute, to give a few introductory remarks and a welcome from the Foundation. I will then ask our founding chairman, Pete Peterson, to take over and to introduce our speaker for the evening. Andreas, over to you, and then to Pete.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, once again it's a distinct honor for me to be with you tonight at the Peterson Institute for the 8th annual Stavros Niarchos Lecture. On behalf of my colleagues on the board of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, I welcome you to this event and extend my sincere thanks to the Peterson Institute, Fred Deutschman in particular, for serving as our host. The Niarchos Foundation is privileged to have the Peterson Institute as its partner in presenting the series of annual lectures established to commemorate the late Stavros Niarchos, founder and benefactor of our foundation. Mr. Niarchos' business operations began in Greece, the country of his birth, but his accomplishments throughout the 20th century were international in scope, just as are those of the Institute and of tonight's speaker, Mr. Nandan Nilekani, co-founder of and co-chairman of India's-based Infosys Technologies. Previous speakers in this series have included such notables as Alan Greenspan, Mexico's former President Ernesto Zedillo, China's former Foreign Trade Vice Minister Long Yong-tu, and Lawrence Summers. Our speaker tonight is no less distinguished. I very much enjoyed reading Mr. Nilekani's experience and last interview, and to officially introduce him, we have on hand the eponymous founding chairman of the Institute, Mr. Pete Peterson, well known to all of Pete.
Andreas, we of course want to thank you warmly and the Foundation for making this possible. I'm delighted that you've joined our board, and we look forward to the next 24 hours or so with you. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about our director, Fred Bergsten. Fred, this is in the nature of what I call psychic compensation. It's in lieu of cash, in other words. So I assume our negotiations with you are over about compensation. You may actually owe me something. I call Fred the triple threat of the nonprofit world. First of all, Fred has demonstrated a remarkable ability to attract the very best, and I continue to believe that this is the best group of economists anywhere in the world, in any think tank. Secondly, he has demonstrated great ability with his team to pick projects that are insightful and highly relevant, and he knows how to reach out to maximize their public impact. And third, he is the most relentless and effective fundraiser that I know. You may have noticed that when I approach him within 6 feet or so, I have an instinctive Pavlovian need to put both hands in my pockets in an act of self-defense. When I get home, the first question my wife asks is what did Fred get out of you today? The idea of a long-term giving program is nothing that Fred really is familiar with. He operates on a very short-term basis. But Fred, I always get my money's worth, and so do I think anybody that has come here. I'm filled, frankly, with a lot of pride. And Carla, my dear friend who is here, remembers the founding of this institution. And to think that this rather small and young institution, in a global study or opinion poll of hundreds or thousands, there's a thread of think tanks, was tied for first place with Brookings, which is many times larger and much older. So Fred, on behalf of all of us, I'd like you and your team, I'd like you to stand up and accept our warm gratitude, respect, and congratulations. The more I think about this, I think your cash compensation should be reduced by about 25%. We can negotiate that later. I'm delighted now to introduce Nandan Nilekani, who is this year's Niarchos Lecture. Nandan has been named again, as he was a few years ago, by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The crossover breadth of his impact is measured by the fact that the write-up for Time was written by the author of the novel that became the best-selling Oscar-winning film, Slumdog Millionaire. So he is indeed a Renaissance man. Nandan was a middle-class kid from a small town in India. Given my Nebraska small-town origins, I can relate to that. He rose to become co-founder, CEO, and now chairman of Infosys Technologies. He and his colleagues parlayed an initial investment of $250 to today's market capitalization of about $17 billion. I believe that is about the rate of inflation. He has become a corporate icon, both in India and around the world, and is a great brand ambassador for both his company and his country. Nandan has a keen interest and passion for public policy. He has been involved in efforts to improve his city, Bangalore, to design and implement reform of higher education in India as a member of the Knowledge Commission set up by the Prime Minister, and improve governance India-wide by harnessing technology. He's received a host of accolades for his business leadership in both India and around the world. Fortune called him Asia's Businessman of the Year and one of Asia's Power 25. Forbes honored him as Businessman of the Year in 2006. He was named one of the world's most respected business leaders in a global survey by Financial Times, and CNBC has designated him as Corporate Citizen of the Year. He has become a celebrated author with his new book, Imagining India, The Idea of a Renewed Nation. The book has received glowing reviews by the Financial Times and the Economist, and Nandan has recently presented on talk shows with Charlie Rose and Jon Stewart. I'm also delighted to see Tom Friedman, who wrote the introduction to Nandan's book and calls him the great explainer, with us tonight. I told Tom that it's been rumored that Nandan inspired the title of Tom's latest million seller, The World is Flat. Tom has a somewhat different interpretation of history than that, but I'm not going to get involved in litigation, Tom, or arbitration. over his contribution to the title versus yours. Nandan joined the board of directors of the Institute about 2 years ago, so it is a particular honor and privilege to introduce him tonight as our 8th Niarchos Lecturer. We look forward, Nandan, to your remarks with great anticipation. Nandan, please.
Thank you, Pete, for that wonderful and very generous introduction. And it's really a great privilege to be here at the Peterson Institute and to give the 8th Niarchos Memorial Lecture. I chose my topic on India because I had recent research on India, so I had a few things to say about it. And I got into this, you're probably wondering why is this corporate leader trying to write a book on India. And the reason I got into this was that when I started going around the world representing Infosys and representing India, I used to get a lot of questions from people about India's huge contradictions. Now, why is it that on the one hand you have so many billionaires on the Forbes billionaire list, on the other hand you have so many poor people? Why is it that you have built such a beautiful campus at Infosys which looks like a 21st century campus, and you have cities with the world's largest slums? Why is it that you have built this outsourcing industry with so much of high-tech talent, and you have the largest pool of uneducated children? And these were contradictions which I did not have easy answers for, and I used to mumble that it's all politics and go on with it. But as I started having more and more of these questions, I felt the need myself to get to the bottom of why India is the way it is. And this book, in some sense, is my voyage of self-discovery to really find out what's going on the ground. The other thing I found was that rather than write about events which lead to a historical perspective or write about people which lead to biographies, I thought the best way to describe a country like India is through the evolution of ideas. Because I felt that India, like the United States, is a country that is moved and motivated by ideas. It is only when ideas become, people accept ideas and they gain a broad swath of support that things start moving in a country like India. And therefore I thought I could use ideas to describe the changes happening in India. The other reason I thought ideas was a good way to look at India was that I could use that to describe the past. I could use that to see what's happening in the present, and I could use the potential flow of ideas into the future to perhaps anticipate how the future could evolve. And therefore, this book became a book of ideas. And when I noticed, and I looked around and looked at the ideas that seemed to be shaping India, I saw a certain pattern emerging. You remember, at the end of the day, I'm an electrical engineer, so I look for patterns all the time. And I found that there were some ideas which were responsible for India's resurgence and revitalization in the world today. I found there were other ideas which there was no argument, where there was broad bipartisan support but it was not getting done. I found there were some ideas which were furiously argued about. And then I said, perhaps there are some things which we can learn from the fact that we are coming late to the development party. And perhaps by looking at the challenges and other things in the rich countries, maybe there are some ideas we can anticipate and perhaps do them with the benefit of hindsight. That was the way I looked at it. Now, what are these ideas responsible for this energy, this vitality that you see? And what is this vitality all about? Now, in the 1960s, India used to grow at the rate of 3.5% a year. And this rate of growth was called as the Hindu rate of growth. It was assumed that this was inviolate, this was ordained by God. You could neither grow lower nor faster than 3.5%. And in the 1960s, India's population grew at the rate of 2% a year. So when the population grows at 2% and the economy grows at 3.5%, it takes 40 to 45 years before per capita incomes double. It would have taken that much time to eliminate the challenges of poverty and improving incomes. Today's India, in the last 4 to 5 years, has been growing at 8 to 9%. And even now, in the midst of the most global economic crisis since the Depression, it's growing at 6%, and I have no doubt that once we get past this economic crisis, it has the potential again to grow at 8 to 9%. While the economy is growing faster, the population growth is growing slower. The population growth rate, which was 2% in the 60s, has come to 1.5%. And when the population grows at 1.5% and the economy grows at 8 to 9%, incomes double every 10 years. And therefore you have an economy which once took 45 years to double incomes, now doubling incomes every 10 years. In other words, let's say you had a car which is traveling at 25 miles an hour, and suddenly this very same car is traveling at 100 miles an hour. So that's the change that you see. At the same time, the politics, the social issues, the institutional challenges continue to be the same. So on the one hand, you have this acceleration of economic growth supported by a young aspirational population. On the other hand, you have ancient and often exclusive methods of society. You have caste, you have communalism, you have corruption, you have institutions that were built 200 years back. And it is this collision between this young, dynamic, upsurge population growing at 8%, meeting this antiquated structure of the past, is at the root of all its challenges and contradictions, and I've tried to describe that. Now, what is it that happened in India which led to this economy which is growing at the sedate pace of 3.5%, suddenly start growing at 8 to 9%? And I believe there are 6 big things that change in the Indian mind which are responsible for this change in growth. The first big thing is the change in our view of our population as a burden to an asset, from something which is a liability to something which is human capital. Because once you start believing that your people are human capital, then you start saying, what do I need to do to leverage my human capital? How do I educate them? How do I keep them healthy? How do I make sure that there are roads to go to work in school? How do I make sure there are lights to study at night? How do I make sure there are good markets for jobs for them? And therefore, our whole attitude towards the population changes. And this change in the Indian view of population from burden to human capital is central to the change happening in India. It also so happens that India is having this change in its view of its population exactly at the time that it is experiencing its demographic dividend. In other words, the next 30 to 40 years, India will have a large number of people in the working age of say 18 to 65 and relatively very few people who are young and old because of improvements in birth rates and so forth. And that is going to create a huge upsurge of activity, because when you have your demographic dividend, it's a time when more people are working, less people have to be supported, more people are working means more income growth means more savings means more investment means more economic growth, so it creates a virtuous cycle of doing that. And therefore India is having this demographic dividend. And what is also unique is not only that India, many countries have had the demographic dividend. The US, for example, had a dividend after the Second World War when they had the whole baby boom generation and so forth. But what is unique about the Indian demographic dividend is India will be the only country in the world to have a demographic dividend, which makes it particularly unique. Because 30 years back, India and China had roughly the same numbers, but China implemented the one-child policy, which led to an acceleration of its demographic dividend. But the result of that is that in the next 30 years, the aging will start in China much more rapidly because of one child, whereas India will have this young workforce. And therefore, the fact that we are seeing our people as human capital, the fact that we're going to enjoy a demographic dividend, and the fact that we're the only country in the world to enjoy a demographic dividend makes India's opportunity very, very special. The second big thing, I believe, is the change in India of its view of the entrepreneur. Because in early India, early independent India, capitalism and imperialism were seen as two sides of the same coin. And therefore the state had a very large role in the economy, which led to the consequent misdirection of entrepreneurship that we saw. But today we live in India, where the entrepreneur is celebrated and is considered as a very vital person. And that is a big change. And India today has, I believe, among the most diverse and vital set of entrepreneurs who are also given a lot more room to play. And I call this phenomenon, I use a metaphor from Bombay plant to Bombay club to Bombay house. Because in the 1940s, the businessmen of the day came together, the leading businessmen, J.R.B. Tata, G.D. Birla, came together and wrote something called the Bombay Plan to describe their vision of an independent India. And they were very clear that the state must play a very large role, that private capital would not be able to build the sinews and muscles of the new India, and therefore the public spending had to be done, and they wanted to make sure that they had a certain amount of protection so that they could keep making money. And then in 1991, when India had its economic reforms, another bunch of businessmen got together in another five-star hotel in Bombay, and that was called the Bombay Club. The Bombay Club said, look, for the last 40 years, we have been working in a protected environment with high tariffs, import substitution, and suddenly you guys are opening up the walls, you're going to let foreign capital come in, you're going to allow foreign MNCs to come in. And our domestic capitalists will get destroyed by this avalanche coming in from outside. and therefore we need some time. We probably need another 40 years to become efficient. So please give us some more protection. So the Bombay Club of 1992 was about protectionism. Today, it is about Bombay House. Bombay House is the capital building where the Tata Group operates from. The Tata Group is truly a global group with operations in cars, hotels, steel, software all over the world. Their aspiration is to have more than 50% of the revenue outside the US, and they believe in global competition. And therefore, this is a fundamental change in the mindset of the Indian entrepreneur from someone in the 40s who wanted the state to play a large role in the economy to someone in the 90s who wanted the state to protect them from foreign invasion to someone in 2009 who is ready and willing and able to have global competition. That's the second big thing. The third big thing is our attitude towards technology. India, for a long time, had a very ambivalent and very negative view of computer technology. In the 1960s, people referred to computers as job-eating machines. So they ate up jobs. If you got computers, somebody's job got eaten up. And as late as the 1980s, when the Reserve Bank of India came out with a report on bank computerization, they didn't use the word computers. They called them ledger posting machines. And they believed that this would perhaps fool the unions into believing that they're simple, innocuous little boxes. And when they wanted to come up with the second report, which said these ledger posting machines have to become more powerful, they called them advanced ledger posting machines, hoping that will further convince them that nothing is going to go awry. Now, from an era when we were not even willing to utter the word computer, we now live in a society which sells 10 million mobile phones a month. 99% of those mobile phones are prepaid, which means the people who have them don't even have a credit history. And 40% of those mobile phones, the average recharge is less than 10 rupees, which is 20 cents. And technology has therefore gone from something which was intimidating behind a glass door to something which is empowering for 300 million people. And every one of them is a computer. And there are many such examples of how technology and computers have made it liberating, uplifting, and empowering for the Indian citizen. So the Indian citizen has a much more positive view of technology. The fourth thing is English. When English came to India in the 1830s, it came because the British East India Company wanted to do outsourcing. Because what was happening was the British East India Company had to import a lot of expatriate English workers to work for them in India, and they found it was getting very expensive. So they said, why not teach the Indians English so that they can also work for us locally and perhaps we can save some money. So it all began with outsourcing. Now, when the Indians learned English, there were two unexpected consequences. All these things have the law of unintended consequences. The first was Indians found a common language to talk to each other. So the Tamilian in Chennai could talk to the Bengali in Calcutta, could talk to the Punjabi in Lahore. So it created a pan-Indian language of communication. The second thing it did was it exposed the Indians to Western intellectual literature. They started reading Voltaire and Mill and all that. And they said, what is all this liberty, equality and all this stuff? How come we don't get this? So teaching the Indians English also provided the basis for them taking up the whole issue of Indian independence. And ultimately, after a long struggle, peaceful struggle, they got independent in 1947. But at that time, it looked a bit funny that English should stay in a country where you have just got independent. English personified the language of the imperialists, and therefore they said we must have our own languages. English needs to be, ultimately, it can't be in a free country, we can't have English, we should have our own languages, and they came up with the language policy. There's only one problem, there was no one Indian language that everybody spoke. There were hundreds of languages, and Hindi was one of the main languages we had. But then the South Indians said, you know what, we don't know this Hindi stuff. And if you make Hindi a national language, and if you make that the language of business, and the language to get jobs in government, then we will be at a disadvantage because the guys who grew up learning Hindi as a mother tongue will be much better off than those of us who are going to learn it elsewhere. So they said, no way, it's not going to happen. And finally a deal was struck in 1950 that English would stay in India for 15 more years. It was purely a transitional arrangement. 1964 came along, and the Tamilians had still not learned English. And this time they got violent. They started burning themselves in Chennai. And finally, a government, a non-Congress government, for the first time came to power in Tamil Nadu. And there was so much of an uproar about this Hindi-English thing that finally they said, okay, forget it, let's keep English, we'll keep that as a linked language for the next, for indefinitely. And so English stayed in India. And then in the 1990s, we had globalization, we had liberalization, we had outsourcing. And suddenly English became the vehicle for global access. The Indians suddenly found that those who knew English could participate in the global economy. and therefore it became an aspirational language. So there's now there's no politics about English. Everybody wants to learn English. The poor want their children to learn English, so the whole English debate is out of the way, and English is now accepted and aspirational as a language. The fifth thing is clearly Indian view of globalization. In the 1950s, India viewed globalization negatively. It believed in having high tariff barriers, import substitution, self-reliance, all those things. But today, India is much more common globalization. Indian companies are globally competitive. Indians go all over the place. There are 200,000 Indian students studying abroad. Indian workers living outside India remit $30 billion a year inward remittances back home. Suddenly, globalization has become a very positive thing for Indians. And therefore, in the Indian mind, globalization has turned from being something to be scared about to something that they can adopt. And the sixth big idea, I believe, is the Indian view of democracy. Because in the 1940s, Indian democracy was an elite concept. It was a bunch of visionary leaders who wanted to bring in modern concepts of democracy, free speech, one man, one vote, and so on and so forth. It was not only something that the people were asking for. But today, democracy in India is truly and totally embedded. And nothing, I think, personifies that more than the current election, which, as you know, is going on. This election is a mammoth election. There are 714 million voters. There are over 1 million voting machines, all electronic voting machines. It's being held over 5 days or a month. In fact, today is the fourth or the fifth session. We have the final session voting on the 13th of May and the results on the 16th. And this is purely, it's an extraordinary spectacle to watch these 700 million people, this billion people deciding in a peaceful manner, a peaceful transition of power, which I think is very, very important. And therefore, democracy has gone from being an elite concept to something which people believe in. And it's not just democracy in the sense of parliament democracy, it's democracy in the sense of non-profit organizations, there are millions of them. It's democracy in terms of panchayat, there are village leadership, there are millions of village leaders. So the whole thing is bustling with this democracy. And that's a big change, open society, democracy, aspiration, so forth. So these are, believe, the 6 big reasons for the acceleration of the Indian economy. The fact that the population was seen as human capital, the fact that entrepreneurs now became respected and confident to take on global competition, the fact that technology is now seen as empowering, the fact that English has become a language of aspiration, the fact that globalization is seen by Indians as a positive force, and the fact that democracy has become deeply and broadly embedded in the Indian society. So these 6 things, which are unique by the way, because there's no other country on the planet which has all these 6 things in its favor, is at the root of the success of where India is. Now, so far it sounds like the BJP's India shining, kind of campaign of 2004 when they lost the election. But then come the challenges. One set of challenges are some things which Indians have agreed about but simply not done. Primary education, for example, is a great failure because unlike many countries in Asia, India neglected its primary education and had this large number of young people with no education. I believe that is now changing, partly because the economic reforms showed the poor people how much is the cost of not being educated. And therefore they have made up their minds that even if they don't have the education, their children will have the education. And they're saying, the government schools don't perform, then you will send them to private schools. These are not, this is not Phillips Academy or something. These are one-room apartments where people pay a very small amount of fees. And today in urban India, 50% of the children go to, poor children go to private schools because the public schools is failing them. At the same time, the state is spending a lot more money on education. The state is spending billions of dollars on education, not often wisely, but it is spending the money. So this fact that there is demand from the people for education and the supply side is getting reformed, that I believe ultimately lead to tackling the issue of primary education. Similarly, infrastructure. Infrastructure in India for many years was a lost cause. Those of you who come still think it's probably a lost cause. But there is change on infrastructure. I think infrastructure is now politically salient. In the 1970s, the election slogans were Roti, Kapda, Makan, which meant food, clothing and shelter. Today's election slogan is Bijli, Sadak, Pani, which means power, water and roads. So elections are about infrastructure. Today's election slogan is broadband for all, infrastructure. So fundamentally, infrastructure has now got political salience and no party can really come into power without addressing infrastructure. So I do believe that infrastructure will slowly, it will not happen at the speed of China, but it will start happening on the ground. The third idea which I think is finally taken root is urbanization. Again, India had a very ambivalent view of urbanization because of many reasons. One was that Gandhi was very influential, believed in the idea of the village republic, and that India lives in the village and the romance of the village and so forth. And he said that cities are evil places. And The other reason was the British ruled from the Indian city, and therefore for newly independent, proud India, the cities were a constant reminder of the British Raj. So when Nehru came to work every day, he entered into the building designed by the famous British architect Lutyens in 1928. And therefore, Nehru actually said that New Delhi is an un-Indian city. It doesn't look like an Indian city. So you want to build a new city that didn't have any trace of British legacies. But anyway, the cities didn't happen, and the politics also changed because rural residents ended up becoming 80% of the voters, and they had no interest in cities, so the politics swayed to a rural vote. But today I believe that's changing for a number of reasons, including the fact that the current election is the first election after we have redesigned our constituencies. And now the constituencies represent the urbanization that has happened in India. And fully 120 of the MPs that are going to be elected out of the 543 on May 16 are from urban areas. And therefore, urban issues, I believe, will improve, and ultimately our cities will start improving. And the fourth thing, I think, which people have accepted is that India should be a single market. Because if we didn't have markets, who cared about a single market? So when we start having markets, then we realize your markets are not single. And therefore, there's a huge amount of progress now on our taxation and so forth to make sure that goods and services can move across the country very easily. So these four ideas, the notion of primary education, the notion of infrastructure, the notion of urbanization, the notion of single markets, I believe these ideas are going to happen. It doesn't matter whether 3 parties or 30 parties form the next government on May 16th. These will happen because these have complete multi-partisan support, and the idea is deeply embedded in the Indian psyche. So what are the arguments about? The arguments are clearly on big issues. What should be our higher education policy? Because how many universities do we have? How much should we deregulate them? Do we allow private universities? Do we allow foreign universities? Do we allow them to raise fees? So higher education, unlike primary education, is caught in a huge ideological battle between the left and the right. The left wants to control the universities because they want to put their ideology in it. The right wants to do it for the same reason, and therefore higher education in India is in a complete gridlock. The second thing is the whole issue of affirmative action. As a country which practiced the most sophisticated form of social exclusion known to mankind, the caste system, how do we redress the past? How do we make sure that this fully 1/4 of the population gets a chance to participate in the modern economy? Do you do that through reservations? Do you do that through affirmative action? Do you do that by expanding access? This is a very, very contentious issue, and it becomes even more contentious because of the rise of caste-based parties who argue for their caste, and so that's become a very complicated issue. And the third issue, which is a big argument about, is really the argument about labor reforms, because we have a very funny system where only 2% of our labor has ultra-high labor protection, and 93% of labor has no labor protection. So when there's an economic slowdown, it's those 93% who get hurt the first. But nobody has had the stuff to get around to cleaning up the labor reforms. And I believe these 3 things are what are really holding up the next stage of the economy. Now, if India is able to build on these 6 ideas I talked about, like demographics and entrepreneurship, if it's able to quickly implement the 4 ideas I talked about, like private education and infrastructure, and is able to resolve its arguments about higher education and labor reforms, it has the potential to grow at a very rapid clip for the next 30 to 40 years, because it already has a savings rate of 35% because of its young population. The savings rate is expected to go to about 40%. So all the other factors are in our favor. Now, let's assume that India is able to get on with this cycle of prosperity. What does it have to worry about? It has to worry about issues close to Pete's heart. Pensions. How do we make sure in a young country you create a form of social insurance and entitlements that does not create a $50 trillion burden, right? That's your analysis of the burden in the US. How do you make sure they don't create a huge burden when the country becomes old? Because now we know that what happens when you create with the good intention, you create entitlements, because the entitlements, you can't take them back. And end up getting, and therefore we have an aging population, and the number of people working is much less than the number to support, then the whole economics goes completely the other way. And we are seeing this problem in the US, we are seeing this problem in Europe, we are seeing this problem in Japan. And therefore, when you are a young country, knowing the challenges of the Western world, knowing what happens when you have entitlement that get locked in, is there a better way of designing these things? How can we find a balance between social insurance and making sure that the economy does not get crippled when it becomes old? And we can learn from all the experiences we've had. So that's one area where India can anticipate its future. The second is in the area of health. India has this unique thing. On the one hand, it has all the problems of malnutrition and diarrhea and all that. It also, because its population, which is rapidly becoming prosperous, is getting all the challenges of the rich countries. It has diabetes, it's the world champion in diabetes, heart attacks, obesity, all the stuff. And therefore, is there a better way to look at this whole health thing and make sure that people are able to plan the health differently and create a healthcare system which has incentive for people to be healthy, as opposed to a healthcare system where you increase costs. And therefore, again, we can learn from what's happening in other countries and redesign it because we have a clean slate. So these are two things which I believe we can anticipate in the future. Another thing we have to think about is environment. It's clear that environment is going to be a huge issue. Now, just to give you an idea, if India's economy, hypothetically grows at say 6 to 8% a year, within 40 years, by 2050, its per capita income will go up 10 times, at least. That means a GDP of 1 trillion will become 10 trillion. But can we deal with the environmental consequences and the lifestyle changes that will bring in? Nobody has a clue. And therefore, we have to think of a development model which aligns the environment and develop and make sure that people's quality of life improves without environmental impact. Nobody's done that, but if we are able to do that, that again is a new challenge we need to anticipate. And finally, we will deal with the challenge of energy. Clearly, with the challenge of global warming, if the world population is going to go from 6 billion to 9 billion, and India is going to be 1.6 billion out of that, then clearly we have to have a new paradigm of energy which is not based on coal and oil, and which looks at new forms of energy and so on, and really creates a post-carbon economy. And the advantage India has, it has not built the trillions of dollars in the legacy infrastructure, and therefore can develop right now a different paradigm of infrastructure which addresses the challenge of energy and gives better, better post-carbon capability. And to me, that is what I call the ideas India needs to anticipate. The fact that we need to look at our pensions, our healthcare, look at energy environment. So remembering that we are a young country which is going to prosper rapidly, so anticipate what should be done in the future. Now, I think the important thing is this is all happening, as I said, in a very democratic setup. We talked about the elections and the results, and frankly, no one knows what the election results are going to be and what combination of parties is going to come into power. But that is all the more important that these ideas emerge, because ultimately the unity comes by people aligning around ideas. And therefore, ideas become the glue which will hold it together. And that's one of the reasons why I try to put this together, because I think when a country is at a point when it has such a huge opportunity, it really needs to think about it in a very different way. The other thing is, you may argue, so what? What does this have to do with us? Clearly, I think the fate of a country which has a population of 1 billion people going up to 1.6 billion by 2050 is an important issue for all of us. But more importantly, we have to think about what will happen if India is not able to encash its demographic dividend. When you look at the demographic dividend, you actually find that there are two curves. There is one curve in the south, which is already going to start aging in the next 10 years. And the real demographic dividend for the next 30-40 years is going to be in middle India, the states of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, all these 6 states. To give you a sense of the scale, the fertility rate in Kerala, which is a southern state which is considered very progressive for its human development indicators, is 1.8. In Uttar Pradesh, it's 4.8. In the same country, 2 different states, one fertility rate is 1.8, one fertility rate is 4.8. That's the difference. In the next 25 years, only 12.6% of the babies born will be born in the south. 50% will be born in these 5 or 6 states in middle India. So the real challenge is when that comes. And one thing is very clear, that you have this young population whose aspirations have been unleashed, who have access to the same media you and I have, who have access to mobile phones, who have access to television, internet, and they are wanting a better life. And if you do the right things, they will enjoy a better life and will create this virtuous cycle I talked about. On the other hand, if you don't do the right things in making sure they have the skills to work, make sure they have the roads to go to school, making sure they have jobs, this same young population is going to be thwarted in its aspirations and ambitions. And now it's very clear around the world, and we know what's happening in our region, that having a lot of young unemployed men is where the problem starts, because then they become accessible and vulnerable to every kind of extremism and atavism that you have out there. and therefore making sure that India takes this demographic bubble, which is going to happen next, the biggest in the world, and make sure that we convert that and encash a dividend is hugely and strategically important for the world. Thank you very much.